Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson, Canada will soon have a new Prime Minister. But how will Mark Carney, the former Governor of the Bank of England, choose to handle Donald Trump and his tariffs?
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yelda Hakim.
And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
We're on the ground in some of the world's toughest places. Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yelda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.
Canada will soon have a new Prime Minister. The governing Liberal Party has been holding internal elections following the resignation of Justin Trudeau. And the man replacing him, well, you might recognise the name, former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney.
We didn't ask for this fight, but Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. They should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win.
Now, Mr Carney has certainly got plenty of experience in the world of banking. When it comes to politics, not so much so. But with Donald Trump threatening an all-out trade war with his neighbour to the north, could Carney be the man to put the president in his place? Well, let's start with someone who knew him well, thanks to his time as the country's central banker, our economics editor, Ed Conway. Ed, so who is Mark Carney? I mean, he does have a pretty impressive CV.
Yeah, he's got a very impressive CV, perhaps better than almost anyone else out there, at least in the world of finance. So he started his life as a banker. He went and did a master's at Oxford, which is kind of how he came to the UK, and I think also how he met his wife, who's English. And then he went into kind of banking, so he was in Goldman Sachs. Then he went into central banking, so he became the Central Bank of Canada's governor. And then after that, he was kind of poached by George Osborne to become the Bank of England governor. And so it's this glittering career, really. And when he came in, Osborne was really proud. I remember it quite vividly. He was so proud to have gotten Mark Carney, because it was this point where Mervyn King was coming to the end of his tenure. There was this big question mark about who on earth is going to succeed him, because he was very, very much a big fish. And Mark Carney was seen as this kind of, some people even described him as the George Clooney of central banking, because he's a good-looking guy. But anyway, so he was brought in as this superstar central banker at a time when actually it looked like the UK, we were in recovery from the financial crisis, the euro crisis was ongoing. He was going to be the guy who was going to bring the country back to recovery. But in the event, he kind of presided over a series of different crises, most of which weren't his making, but he kind of got himself involved. So you had the Scottish referendum, and quite early on in his tenure, he gave a speech on that, which a lot of people thought, that's bold in kind of almost inverted commas, because if you're a central banker, you're generally not expected to intervene in politics, okay? But he did say something, and he couched his intervention quite carefully to make it seem like he wasn't intervening, but it was nonetheless an intervention. And then even more so on Brexit, he made it pretty clear that this was not an idea that he thought was a good idea. And then obviously that happened, and I think in the days after the referendum, when obviously the government, David Cameron, basically kind of imploded, and there was this sense of this vacuum, I mean, who is actually in charge? He was the man who stood up and said, listen, I'm still in office, I'm going to do something about this, and then did some emergency measures, so quantitative easing and cutting interest rates. And so it was that point where a lot of people thought, well, he's the only grown-up in the room. That being said, there were other people who thought, well, you shouldn't have intervened in the first place in this, and still some people who look back at the kind of Carney era and think, well, he was too political. And I mean, lo and behold, here he is becoming Prime Minister of Canada. So clearly he is political fundamentally.
But having been politics adjacent, technically, for so much of his career, central bank in Canada and central bank here, I suppose he has been pretty much prepared to make that job. It doesn't look that daft a decision to return to Canada and go for the top job.
No, I mean, to be honest with you, when he came and became Governor of the Bank of England, at the time people were saying, well, the thing that he would eventually like to do is to become Prime Minister of Canada. But right now, there's Justin Trudeau. It doesn't look like he's got any chance of it. And then things have gone his way. A lot of people I come across who know Mark Carney kind of well, they just say, he's quite a lucky guy because he's often in the right place at the right time.
Thanks, Ed, and we will be back with him just a little later. But before we do, let's head to Canada to see how Mr Carney's win is going down there. Catherine Cullen is host of CBC's award-winning political show, The House. Catherine, so how did he do it? I mean, obviously, bearing in mind, this was just an internal party poll, not a general election.
I mean, I think in a strange way, you could argue that Mark Carney might have Donald Trump a bit to thank for this moment, because he has pitched himself as somebody with experience in a crisis, pointing to his time as the governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, and of course his time as the governor of the Bank of England during Brexit. And so he is using that experience to say, hey, Canadians, I know how to handle a crisis. We are in the midst of one when it comes to tariffs and Donald Trump. I am the right person for this moment. And it seems, based on public opinion polling, that a significant number of Canadians are ready to listen. And certainly within the Liberal Party, which has just made him their new leader and prime minister designate in this country, there was a resounding result, almost 86% of the points last night. Liberal Party members certainly ready for the Mark Carney era.
So he has plenty of economic experience, but as already mentioned on the podcast, he has been politics adjacent, not directly involved in that. I mean, was that not a concern for some members of the party?
He has tried to paint that as an asset. He says often, I'm not a politician. The person he will be running against in a federal election, which we are probably only weeks away from a federal election campaign, is somebody who has been a career politician. So Mark Carney is trying to make it an asset that he comes from outside politics. I will say, some commentators have observed that he is still sort of finding his political feet, right? Like he's still learning how to deliver that attack line, how to make give a rousing political speech. The Liberals I spoke to last night after he gave his acceptance speech seemed pretty happy with what he had to say. But man, talk about a sharp learning curve.
Yeah, indeed. But how is he viewed then by the ordinary Canadian?
I mean, certainly he is somebody whose name is known by Canadians who follow politics, particularly when you think back to that 2008 financial crisis. But I would say if you were to go to the coffee shop next door to the place where we broadcast here and ask people if they were talking about Mark Carney 2 years ago, I mean, the answer would not be yes. He's not a household name. And that also makes his win that much more interesting. The primary opponent that he had was Chrystia Freeland. She was Canada's deputy prime minister. She was Canada's finance minister. She's also the one who, frankly, pushed Justin Trudeau off the political cliff. So she had a lot of political visibility in this country. And it does make it striking that Mark Carney, again, not necessarily a household name, but not an unknown, was able to find such momentum in this race that really carried him the whole way through.
I mean, you've already said, Catherine, that he has Donald Trump to an extent to thank, a large extent perhaps, to thank for his victory. So just to move away from Mark Carney for a second and explain what it has been like to be a Canadian hearing the words that Donald Trump has used, talking about annexing Canada, of all things.
I think a lot of Canadians feel that perhaps much of the world does not quite understand the feeling that Canadians are having at this moment. I was down in Washington, D.C. just recently speaking to our ambassador there, some of our cabinet ministers who are visiting Washington, D.C. And there are still people cracking jokes about Canada as a 51st state. That does not fly. It is not funny in this country. There are many people who are very alarmed. Our political leaders across the aisle are resolute. Canada will not become a 51st state. Mr. Trump, of course, has said it's not something that he would do through military force, but rather through economic force. It really has galvanized people in this country and inflamed a sense of patriotism that we haven't seen in some time. And of course, he has put tariffs into action against Canada. Now, there have been carve-outs. A big portion of those tariffs are no longer in effect, but the federal officials have been clear. This is not, a short game. Canada is still in a very difficult position, and they expect that this is going to continue for some time. We are in a trade war with the United States, a country that Canada has long talked about as its closest friend and ally. The fact of the matter is he has a big baseball bat in terms of the size of the U.S. economy, his ability to put tariffs in place, and Canada's dependence on the United States. So there is a scramble to try to make us less dependent, a scramble to sort of stiffen our spines. But the consequences of this are going to be real.
I mean, Donald Trump may well have a very big baseball bat, but Mark Carney, after the election, has been wielding his hockey stick quite significantly. Walk us through what he's been saying, because there have been a few ice hockey references this Scotsman on this side of the Atlantic didn't entirely understand. What's been his approach to Trump so far?
We should just like pour a big vat of maple syrup over ourselves sometimes in Canadian politics. We lean into, and I have to say, like, the hockey references, whatever political party makes them, they do resonate in this country. Mark Carney has made the point. In fact, I thought this was an interesting one. He has said, as he tried to differentiate himself from Justin Trudeau, he's a snowboarder, I'm a goalie. And that's supposed to say something, I think, about the differences between the two men and their character. What precisely he was getting at, I mean, I think you can see that there might be a meaning in there about putting on a bit of a show versus like being defensive and strategic. Maybe, I don't know. Mr. Carney was certainly leaning into some of those hockey references last night and being very pointed about the United States. There were a couple of things that he said during his victory speech that I thought were particularly significant. He said, my government will keep tariffs on until the Americans show us respect. He has some latitude here. The counter tariffs that Canada is putting in place in order to try to put economic pressure on Americans, those are going to hurt Canadians. That is things like charging more money for, Americans bring orange juice into this country. So the result is that Canadians may pay more for orange juice at the store. And it's not just orange juice. In fact, there's an incredibly long list of products that Canada is putting tariffs on. A lot of them are groceries, also cosmetics, things like that. Those are the ones that Canadians are going to feel at a time of economic challenge, certainly concerns about the cost of living. This is going to make things more expensive for Canadians. So I thought it was striking that he really laid out a clear line there and said, we aren't backing down on this. This is the right path forward, knowing that there may, I think, be some political friction. I also thought it was striking that Mr. Carney said in his victory speech, the U.S. is a country we can no longer trust. I mean, I really think it speaks to the divide. And yeah, a little extra patriotism sauce, maple syrup, I guess, on top of that with the hockey reference, because we just had a big hockey tournament with the United States where we won,
yeah.
which was it was a pretty important win for Canadians because of the strain that we're feeling right now. So perhaps, again, just sort of like pushing on that patriotism button.
Okay, Catherine, just to be clear, for those who are not as au fait with Canadian politics as you, he's become leader of the Liberal Party and therefore becomes Prime Minister because they are in power right now, even though he doesn't have a seat in Parliament. But he still has an election to fight, and that election might be coming, sooner than expected.
Yes, he's got quite a to-do list, right? He's Prime Minister designate right now. He needs to be sworn in as Prime Minister, so the baton passed from himself to Justin Trudeau. And then Mr. Carney has some discretion about how quickly we go to a federal election. Now, in fact, an election isn't scheduled until October, but I think it's widely understood in Canada that we are talking about days, perhaps weeks, until the campaign begins. It's going to be an election like never before for Canadians, right? The specter of this existential threat from the United States, both in the forms of tariffs and also these questions about our sovereignty.
And will it then, in your mind, be almost entirely focused on this issue of the United States and Donald Trump as president?
You could make a case that there will still be kitchen table pocketbook issues, things like the consumer carbon tax, just the cost of living. What is the government going to do for me? Tax cuts. And I do think that those will be very live issues, but it's impossible for them not to intersect with a conversation about Donald Trump, the future of Canada's economy. And I think at the end of the day, what a big portion of that is going to look like is who is best equipped to deal with Donald Trump.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, let's get a final thought from Ed Conway. Ed, look, at a time of a trade war, tariffs being imposed left, right and centre, do you really want an economist as Prime Minister rather than a career politician? Honestly.
He's a really smart guy. He's clearly very ambitious. He's charming. He's a charming man. He's also quite funny. He's got a good sense of humour. He's quite a joker. So, when you're a central banker, you're not generally associated with having a good sense of humour, having a kind of wisecracking attitude. But he does, actually. And that's not always apparent because he kind of keeps it quite kind of buttoned up when he does these speeches. And frankly, he is not historically, if you've seen him give speeches, he's not a brilliant speech maker. He doesn't have that kind of version of political charisma. But you can see on the campaign trail, it's been interesting for me to watch as someone who's listened to his speeches for a long time, has talked to him quite a lot, to see him becoming more overtly political and doing catchphrases and doing kind of speeches that are more tub-thumping speeches. And he's got better and better and more charismatic at doing those speeches over time. So you can see his evolution has happened. And he is more of a politician now than he was before, but nonetheless a politician who's really underlining his kind of trump card, which in this case is in the face of Donald Trump, in the face of tariffs, in the face of all of these economic challenges, you need someone who's a grown up, and you need someone who understands economics. And I'm that guy. That's been his pitch.
That aside, is there anything in your experience of the man that would suggest that Mark Carney would be cowed by a belligerent Donald Trump?
He is very political with a small p, but he's got courage. I've seen that at times. He doesn't like it when people kind of fight back against him. And, he can have a bit of a temper as well. And we'll see whether those things would show up in the White House. I mean, he has obviously encountered Donald Trump during his time, as Bank of England governor. And so it's very hard to say, but he is making a lot of the fact that he's got experience. And he did have experience, at the Bank of England, but that's a very bureaucratic experience. And everything, when you're Bank of England governor, is much more controlled. Your environment is much more controlled. And going from being someone who is really, really well respected. I mean, think about Rishi Sunak as a good example of that. Someone who's really respected within the world of finance, within the world of, economic policy making. Going from that world to being a prime minister when anything can be thrown at you, and when you're having to deal with the ultimate disruptor, which is Donald Trump across the border, that is a very new kind of challenge. And I don't know that we know how well he's going to cope in the face of that.
Thanks, Ed. That's a lot for this edition of The Daily. We are back again tomorrow.
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
We're on the ground in some of the world's toughest places. Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.